that's a poster that someone spent an awful lot of time making, which is, well, I don't even know what to say about that.
I first got to know Jordan when he applied for a job in psychology at the University of Toronto. That was about 20 years ago. After he was hired, I think he was a good hire. I mean, I remained his strong advocate for many years. So this is the third floor of our house where Jordan and his family lived for about 5 months. It looked a little different then, but this is where it was. And we all ate together downstairs. There was not a kitchen up here. And it was a kind of lovely 5 months. We got to know each other very well, got to know his family very well. And afterwards, it remained a kind of familial relationship. I didn't write this article to persuade Jordan of anything. I wrote this because I thought that there are people out there who should know what's going on. What was extremely upsetting to me was the disregard for students, and he was extremely polarizing at a time that more polarization was not helpful.
Well, it caused grief, I would say, is the right way of thinking about it. I regard Bernie as a friend, and he had been a very good friend to me in all sorts of ways and to my family. So it came out of the blue. That was the other thing. It was a real surprise. And I was surprised that we hadn't discussed any of this.
I called him and I said, you know, I'm really upset with what you're doing. I find it really, I was having a blood pressure problem. I said, I don't want to talk about this, but I want you to know that, and I said all these things. He called 8 o'clock the next morning. Bernie, we have to talk. So we're talking. He says, I know this is a sensitive issue in your family. It's not. I have a trans daughter, but Jade's doing extremely well. And I start saying, no, what bothers me, and I'm about to repeat what I had written, and he interrupts me and he says, Bernie, you don't understand. I'm willing to give up everything because I really believe this. I'm willing to give up my job. I'm willing to give up, I don't remember what else he put on the line, because I believe it. And then he says, and Bernie, Tammy, that's his wife, had a dream. He said, okay, what was the dream? And sometimes her dreams are prophetic. What was the dream? She dreamed it was 5 minutes to midnight. The end of the world. And Jordan is there to save us from that. And I know Jordan pretty well by now, and I'm saying, okay, Jordan, there's really nothing to talk about. And I hung up. So it is true that he did call me a number of times since then, many times, and I did not return the calls because he was on a roll. I was watching what he was doing. I thought he was getting nastier, angrier, and I thought there was no reason to talk. because I knew there was no access to Jordan except to say, Jordan, you're doing a great thing, and I believe what you're doing. I did not do this lightly. It's not something I would have liked to do. And it's only the fact that so many people, I'm getting these emails from people saying they're glad that I wrote it, that makes me feel, okay, it was the right thing to do.
I really think this is an important thing, because I've often thought, I spent a lot of time thinking about Hitler, and I was thinking, well, how do you get into a state like that, you know? And you think, well, he's a dictator and he led his people down a bad path. It's like, that's not right. That is not what happened. They had a conspiracy together and went down a bad path. Now, think about it this way. If one person thinks something about you, it's like, whatever, right? But if 5 people tell you that, well, what? Then to start not taking that seriously is kind of narcissistic, right? And if it isn't 5, let's say it's 15 people tell you the same thing or act the same way towards you. It's like, probably you should clue in. Well, what if you're a politician and you're trying out a bunch of different ideas? And you're good at interacting with the crowd. You're charismatic. You watch the crowd. But you're not necessarily all that articulate. You don't have your values all straightened out, but you're kind of angry too. And maybe that's because you spent a bunch of time in World War I in the trenches, which was like no joke, and all your friends got blown up. And then you were unemployed, and then you tried to be an artist, and that didn't work out, even though you were moderately talented. And then maybe the economy fell apart completely on you, hyperinflation. And then maybe there was a communist menace coming in from the East, and there genuinely was. And so you're not the world's happiest clam at that point. And you're talking to people who aren't that happy either, because they were also badly defeated in World War I, and then they had a terrible treaty they had to sign, and they lost part of their territory. And so the crowd's not happy, and neither are you, and there's reason for it. And so you start talking to them. You don't know what you're upset about, and neither does the crowd. So you start to articulate some things about why you might be upset. And some of them fall flat, but you're paying attention to the crowd. So you stop saying those things. And some of the things make the crowd really wake up and listen. And so you start saying more of those things, right? It's an unconscious dialectic between you and the crowd. It's mediated by consciousness, but it's not like you're sitting there saying, although you might be, I'm going to tell this crowd more what it wants to hear. It's more sophisticated than that. And so you do that 1,000 times, and you do that to ever-increasing crowds. And the crowd really starts to go mad, and they basically tell you that you're the savior of the nation. It's like, how many bloody people have to tell you that before you start to believe it? You know, I would say with a typical person, 100 will do it. That'll get you going, man. If 100 people tell you specifically why you're special, you're going to be thinking, even if you're kind of humble to begin with, you're going to be thinking, geez, there's got to be something to this, man. But if it's 1 million people and they're roaring their approval, well, and then when it's a whole nation, it's like, good luck withstanding that. There's just not a chance. How are you going to withstand that? But what I'm saying is that you have to be an extraordinary person, you have to be extraordinarily wise, and you have to take ridiculous precautions if you're going to put yourself in the public sphere like that and expose yourself to that kind of adulation without becoming a puppet of the crowd. And that's what happened to Hitler. I mean, it's not like he wasn't also a conscious manipulator and surrounded himself by people who were propagandists. And all of that. So there was a conscious element, but you got to think these things through and see how that dialectic develops. Like, he learned how to appeal to the darkest fantasies of the crowd. He was really, really good at it. He learned how to appeal to the darkest fantasies of the crowd. And that was a dialectic process, right? The crowd told him what they wanted to hear, and the crowd's a mob at that point. So I don't have to take responsibility for the fact that I'm screaming my approval when I'm surrounded by 1 million people. So I can scream my approval for whatever I want, for whatever dark, revengeful fantasy might be playing out in my imagination, because I'm not going to be held accountable for it.
I knew this was coming because I knew we brought our first hate speech laws in Canada back in the 1980s. We were after this character named Ernst Zundel, who is a particularly despicable piece of work, hard hat wearing, right-wing, anti-Semite, Holocaust denier. You know, he had it all, that guy. And, you know, it was his shenanigans careless, malevolent shenanigans that enticed Canadians into producing hate speech legislation. I thought, no, that's not good. It's not good. You're making a big mistake. We're going to pay for this. It's going to unfold over a long time. Who defines hate? The crucial issue. It's not like it's a scientific category. It's a judgment. And the answer is those whom you least want to have the power to define it, because they're the ones that will take that power to themselves. And if you think that isn't going to affect what you get to say, well, you've got another think coming. So I think we're going to pay for it. And hopefully we'll wake up and push back before we have to pay too high a price.
And some of the things make the crowd really wake up and listen.
We're going to pay for it. So, yeah. And we're going to deserve to pay for it, too.
He's talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Well, you know...
And so you start saying more of those things, right? It's an unconscious dialectic between you and the crowd. It's mediated by consciousness, but it's not like you're sitting there saying, although you might be, I'm going to tell this crowd more what it wants to hear.
Last night I was on this British show called Question Time, which is a very famous British show, and the host asked me about this character named Count Dankula. And his girlfriend had a pug, and I liked Count Dankula because he hated that pug. Dankula didn't like his girlfriend's pug, and so he thought he'd play a mean trick, or a mean/funny trick, and teach it to do a Hail Hitler salute, which I actually thought was quite funny. It's like, I don't see that as glorifying Hitler. It's a pug, for God's sake. It wasn't a, what do you call those, Doberman, you know? It was a pug. That's like teaching a rat to do a Hail Hitler salute. You know, he taught it to, it's so horrible. And I'm gonna be so killed for this. He taught it to do its little salute when he said, gas the Jews, which is not funny, you know? Except it's horribly funny, you know, that's the thing. Well, look, and so yeah, you laugh, that's right, because you're all horrible, and you know perfectly well that it's horribly funny. And
now that'll get you going, man. If 100 people tell you specifically why you're special, you're going to be thinking, even if you're kind of humble to begin with, you're going to be thinking, geez, there's got to be something to this, man. But if it's 1 million people and they're roaring their approval, well, and then when it's a whole nation, it's like, good luck withstanding that. There's just not a chance. How are you going to withstand that?
What I worry about is the preacher-like quality of his. He's been interested in the authoritarian personality. He's been fascinated by the horrible people in history. His house is filled with Stalinist art. He says to remind him about the awful things of that culture.
But I don't have paintings from the Nazi era in my house, and I wouldn't.
And he has a number of YouTubes in which he describes how they operate. And he was doing exactly the same thing.
I spent a lot of time thinking about Hitler, and I was thinking, well, how do you get into a state like that, you know? And you think, well, he's a dictator and he led his people down a bad path. It's like, that's not right. That is not what happened. They had a conspiracy together and went down a bad path. Now, think about it this way. The crowd's not happy and neither are you, and there's reason for it. And so you start talking to them. You don't know what you're upset about. And neither does the crowd. So you start to articulate some things about why you might be upset. And some of them fall flat, but you're paying attention to the crowd. And some of the things make the crowd really wake up and listen. And so you start saying more of those things. But it's not like you're sitting there saying, although you might be, I'm going to tell this crowd more what it wants to hear. It's more sophisticated than that. And so you do that 1,000 times, and you do that to ever-increasing crowds. And the crowd really starts to go mad. And they basically tell you that you're the savior of the nation. It's like, how many bloody people have to tell you that before you start to believe it?
Jordan is a self-styled martyr and a self-styled savior.
When we talked to him a couple of months ago, he said that I'm reaching out to all of these people and I'm trying to bring them in from the dark.
I think he's enabling them to be in the dark. I think he's encouraging misogyny. He's encouraging nastiness. And these people feel enabled, and now they are more actively angry.
One of the things I've always thought about Hitler is that, you know, people, you have to admire Hitler. That's the thing. Because he was an organizational genius. When Hitler came to power, he started not only to rearm, but to reindustrialize the economy. And he was actually pretty damn good at that. So he had a very powerfully developed aesthetic sense. And he spent a lot of his time designing the cities that would be built after World War II was over. And those cities were generally conceptualized by him as places where the arts, or at least the Nazi version of the arts, could flourish. People don't refuse the ambition to become Hitler because they don't have the genocidal motivation. They don't follow that pathway because they don't have the organizational genius. They've got the damn motivation. I mean, there's another book I would recommend called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And Eichmann was really the architect of the final solution in many ways. Eichmann was in no way a psychopath. He was the sort of guy who had his mum do his laundry when he went off to the army. And the Nazis came along and said, well, not only are we going to restore order and greatness, but we're going to bloody well tell you whose fault this is. So you imagine there's all this resentment and hatred brewing underneath the surface, and all this chaos is there, and the desire for order is like clamoring in everyone's minds. And Hitler comes along, and he's a very powerful emotional orator, and he's watching the crowd, and he listens. And when he says thing A, nothing happens. When he says thing B, everybody roars. And so they roar, and so so that's a reinforcement, that's a reward. Mm-hmm. So he becomes the embodiment of the dark desire of the mob. And that's partly why he had the charisma